Section M, Feminist victories and defeats. So while we see most of the kind of protest movements that were happening in the 60s die down, quiet down in the 70s, the one movement that was actually growing louder was the feminist movement. For example, in 1972, famous Title IX is passed, and Title IX officially prohibited discrimination based on sex in any federally assisted educational program. And really where you see Title IX taking effect is within athletics. So now women's sports have to be equally funded with comparison of male sports. So we see Title IX being really, you see it the most in women's sports. Other things that were going on is the feminist movement was trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. This is, of course, the amendment to the Constitution. And as the name would give away, equal rights, what they wanted is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States federal government or by any state on account of sex. So the idea that no discrimination based on sex. Okay, so that was going on. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Also, they had some Supreme Court victories, Reed versus Reed and Fontiero versus Richardson. These two court cases together really said that discrimination based on sex in legislation and in employment was unconstitutional. So that was a huge victory for the feminist movement. And then also the Burger Court, I just love saying the Burger Court. The Supreme Court under Burger passed in 1973 Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion. All right, so of course, not of course, but to me, of course, there was a big backlash in the United States against this feminist movement. They blamed the feminist movement for the increase in the divorce rate. The divorce rate had tripled between 1960 and 1976. The Catholic Church organized a powerful grassroots movement to oppose abortion. Around today, I mean, I was out in front of Planned Parenthood like a week ago with a sign protesting abortion. If you ever want to be flipped off, protest abortion. Nonetheless, let's talk about this Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, as you sometimes see it. This was protested. One of the names you ought to know is her name is Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, saying that this amendment was bitter women seeking a constitutional cure for their personal problems. So some who fought against it thought it was kind of an attack against the traditional family structure, that sort of thing. Okay. Yes, so nonetheless, it got to, the amendment got out there, and the deadline for it to be ratified was 1982. However, when that deadline for ratification came and went, there were only 3 states short of actually getting it ratified. A lot of people who decided not to ratify it, their kind of justification was that the Constitution already included women in it, so this was kind of an unnecessary addition or kind of a redundant addition to the Constitution. So that's kind of why some people justified not passing it, ratifying it. All right, Section N, the 70s in black and white. So we're talking, my friends, about the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement was going very strong in the 60s, as we know, but the 70s, it really kind of fractured. Nonetheless, it was still an issue. We have a Supreme Court case, Milken versus Bradley in 1974, that said that desegregation plans or plans to desegregate schools couldn't require students to move across school district lines, which was saying you couldn't force students to be bused. So this idea has nothing to do with actual buses. School buses were still allowed, but what was happening is to reach the goal of to desegregate the schools, to mix the races in schools, they had to bus students from one area to the next. because especially in cities, right, a lot of the African Americans lived in the inner city, and then a lot of the white children lived in the suburbs. So to desegregate the schools, they would have to bus students from the suburbs to the inner city, or from the inner city to the suburbs. So this Milken versus Bradley case said that no, you can't force students to do this. You can't bus them across district lines. So that's, like I said, really was the biggest impact was the inner city black students versus the white suburban students. That desegregation never really happened well because of this case. I'm a lot of order here. Let me get my notes straight. Okay. Affirmative action. Okay, so we're talking about civil rights. Affirmative action in the 70s was as controversial as ever. Affirmative action, some people called it, the critics of affirmative action called it reverse discrimination. Once again, that's when, like, say, a school, like a college, has like a quota, a certain percentage of their student body should be from a minority group, that sort of thing. So kind of reserving spots for minorities, affirmative action. Well, controversial as ever, we see a Supreme Court case that's a little bit confusing, but we're smart people, we'll figure it out. It's called Allen Bake versus the, Allen Bake versus the University of California Regents. So what was happening is Allen Bake wanted to go to medical school at the University of California. However, he did not make the cut, but he felt that he was more qualified to become a doctor or to enter this medical school than some of the African Americans who made it, he thought, through just the affirmative action policies. So this case made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said two things that are kind of a little that kind of contradict each other a little bit. They said, one, okay, our friend Allen Bake should be given a spot at the University of California's medical school. But on the other hand, it said it still upheld the general idea of affirmative action within the University of California as a whole. They said in an attempt to help diversify the student body, that affirmative action was definitely constitutional. So although it's a little kind of contradictory within the court case itself, a lot of people do see it as a victory for affirmative actions because the Supreme Court is upholding affirmative action within the University of California as a whole. All right. Let's talk about our friends, the Native Americans. They kind of throw in a little bit at the end of this section. Native Americans used a lot of the civil rights tactics we had seen used in the South to help kind of gain their own rights, gain their own status as a separate, semi-sovereign people. So when you hear sovereign, just place the word independent there. So semi-independent people. Supreme Court case that upheld this kind of semi-independence is the United States versus Wheeler, which once again said that tribes possessed a unique and limited sovereignty within the United States. Okay. Section O, the Bicentennial Campaign. So of course the United States became a country July 4th, 1776. Of course, July 4th, 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So this is the bicentennial, so this is 200 years later. So 1976 happened to be an election year, so we're going to talk about that election. The Republicans, they decided to keep Ford. They think, he's doing an okay job, we'll keep Ford. And then the Democrats nominate a dark horse candidate, and that being Jimmy Carter. And we'll see Jimmy Carter wins, so we're going to talk about him. Once again, dark horse is kind of like a surprise candidate. So Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia, a peanut farmer, a born-again Christian, a born-again Baptist. That's definitely a part of his personality, part of his character, his Christianity. And really in the 76 election, Carter attacked kind of the what he saw as kind of the corrupt Republicans, pointing fingers back at Nixon and all of those scandals. He said, I'll never lie to the American people, really presenting himself as a Washington outsider who will go in and clean things up. So with this kind of persona, Carter does win. So we see the Democratic president in Carter, and also the House and the Senate will gain Democratic majorities. So Carter definitely has some ability to get some things passed. So what Carter does, he creates the Department of Energy as a cabinet level position. Also, we see he'll cut some taxes. He pardons tens of thousands of Vietnam kind of draft dodgers, those who had burned their draft cards or, dodged the draft. He pardons them to help kind of America heal and move forward from Vietnam. And he really is loved at first, but he really failed to become an insider himself within Washington, D.C. He rubbed a lot of congressmen and advisors the wrong way, that sort of thing. So he, throughout his presidency, will really kind of focus on his own advisors. He kind of brings in from Georgia with him. So he never really mixes with the folks from D.C. He really kind of stays isolated with his Georgian advisors. Okay, Section P. Carter's humanitarian diplomacy. So Carter, Christian, born-again Christian, that's definitely a part of himself. He's definitely concerned for human rights. For example, he championed the oppressed black majority in Zimbabwe. I have my notes out of order. Here we go. But really probably his greatest achievement was the Camp David Accords. So let's talk about it. Camp David Accords, this is Carter in 78. What he does is he invites the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel to come to his kind of presidential retreat at Camp David in Maryland. He has them come and he wants them to kind of talk things out instead of all of these little fighting that happens, like hashtag the Yom Kippur War. He wants them to kind of settle this once and for all, and it's very successful. As a result of the Camp David Accords, Israel decides to give back the land they had won in the 6 Days War, and then in return, what am I talking about? In return, Egypt promises to respect Israel's borders, and they said they'll sign a formal treaty with this more or less as a result within 3 months. Okay, other things that Carter gets accomplished: he establishes full diplomatic relations with China once again. Remember, right after World War II, China had become communist. We had worked at kind of forming that friendship over time, and it becomes official, right? Facebook official. Under Carter, we established full diplomatic relationships with China. Yes, however, these, victories for Carter are definitely overshadowed by the continual Cold War stuff. For example, Cubans, supported by the Soviets, are going into Africa, of all places, and helping a lot of revolutions, communistic revolutions that are occurring in Africa, help supporting the communists in Africa, that sort of thing. Anyway, Section Q, economic and energy woes. So adding to Carter's troubles were economic troubles. We'll talk about the economy first. Inflation was a big deal. By 1980, we had a 13% inflation. Inflation's the idea that the American dollar is not worth what it used to be. So because the American dollar is devalued, the price of goods increases. So that can of pop is going up. Those, new cars are going up. The price of goods is inflated. It's going up. Okay, it's a big problem. It's caused by many things, but definitely wasn't helped by all the deficit spending we were having, right? Spending money we don't have at the federal level. Okay, and it's also at this time where Americans are starting to realize that we are dependent on oil from foreign countries, specifically the Persian Gulf area. So we don't have the option to become an isolated nation again. Remember, after World War I, the United States was kind of, like little turtles hiding in our shells, well, we're not allowed to become isolated again from the rest of the world's problems because we were so dependent on the Persian Gulf, on the oil. Okay, now you know. So kind of this new era of globalization is definitely taking root. People have to learn foreign languages, have to learn about foreign cultures now. It's not just America and everyone else. We're a part of the mix. Okay, so talking about inflation, really it was the elderly that were hurt the most by inflation because the elderly, had a fixed income. They had that check coming in the mail every month, and it's not like they could pick up some more hours at work if they needed to, right? So because goods were increasing, the price of goods are increasing, and their check was staying the same, it was really the elderly that were hurt most by all of this inflation that was going on. This inflation also hurt small businesses and the construction companies. Because what was happening is because money was so devalued, because inflation was so high, banks, in order to make sure they were making profits, increased their interest rates. So, of course, the interest rate is the money banks make by, loaning you money. So say you're taking out some student loans, you'll have an interest rate, 3%, 6%, whatever it might be. You have to pay the bank money for borrowing money. So banks are increasing that interest rate, making it more expensive to get a loan, and that really hurt the small businesses who are dependent on loans, and also hurt the construction industry. Because most people who are building homes need to take out a mortgage, right? A mortgage is a loan you take out for buying a house. They needed to take out a mortgage to build something because the interest rates were so high, people were putting that off. So inflation was not a good thing in the 70s. Economic woes, poor Carter. Back to simpler days, you could have just been a peanut farmer, but no, you had to be the president. Okay, let's talk about energy woes. Yay, why not? Okay, so we're going to be talking about Iran for a while here. So last we left Iran, remember in 53, the leader of Iran started to kind of flirt with the Soviet Union, started to be a little bit too communistic leaning for the United States. So what happened is we sent in the CIA, they overthrew the leader of Iran, and in his place we established the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran is kind of like pro-American leader of Iran. So the Shah of Iran's been there since 53. The problem is he's awfully corrupt and very much oppressive. So the people of Iran decide it's about time to get rid of the Shah of Iran. So in 1979, there is this violent revolution led by kind of Muslim fundamentalists who overthrow the Shah of Iran. They feel the Shah of Iran, besides being oppressive, they feel like he's too westernized, he's too American. They consider America to be the great Satan, very corrupt, very materialistic. So this kind of militant Muslim group goes in Iran in 1979, kicks out the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran flees, he's exiled. And so there's more or less chaos in Iran. There's chaos. Oh no. Okay, so because there's chaos in Iran, this definitely disrupts the flow of oil out of Iran. Because there's political chaos, they're not producing as much oil as they used to. Because there's less of a supply, and because demand is staying steady, the price of oil once again will go up, and once again there'll be really long lines at the gas station. Okay, so Carter has a mess on his hands, right? He has this hyperinflation. I should say hyperinflation, but he has inflation. That's a mess. The whole thing in Iran's a mess, leading to another energy crisis. So Carter's like, I got to figure this out, folks. So he goes to Camp David, his, retreat in Maryland, and he brings in 100 leaders from all walks of life across the United States to come to him and share their views. Things are a mess. I'm open to suggestions. That's what Carter was saying, more or less. And so after he comes out from listening to all of these advisors, he goes on TV and gives this kind of confusing speech. It's called, people have called it the Malays speech, okay? In case you don't know what Malays means, Malays definition is, quote, a vague sense of moral ill-being, okay? So he comes out of Camp David, gives this speech, and more or less he blames Americans, or you could say he criticizes Americans for being too concerned about material goods, for falling into a moral and spiritual crisis. He says there's a growing disrespect for government, and there's a worship of self-indulgence. So he's kind of blaming Americans for being too concerned about material goods in the first place, which of course isn't really helping anybody. You know, pointing fingers is usually not a solution. So nonetheless, after the speech, after he has this retreat at Camp David, he fires four of his cabinet members and kind of draws his group of Georgian advisors even closer together by expanding his personal staff. Okay, and as a result of this speech, it's really Americans are kind of feeling Carter's losing touch. Okay, so it's going to be really hard for Carter to win a second term. In fact, he's not going to. Okay, Section R, Foreign Affairs and Iranian embroglio. Okay, so in case you're wondering what embroglio means, it means extended, or it means extremely confused, complicated, or embarrassing situation. So Iran's just not, that mess is not going to be solved in a simple matter. Okay, so this is what happens. Foreign affairs here. We had SALT I talks in 1969, like 10 years ago in 69. The SALT talks, once again, SALT's an acronym meaning Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. So trying to disarm the Soviet Union, trying to disarm the United States, right? We both agree to lower our nukes, whatever it be. So we had talks, and they were fairly successful in 79. So we decided in 69 they were fairly successful. So we decided to have another set of talks, and these are called SALT II, right? Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, you know, round 2 of negotiations, and this happens in 79 now, limiting the number of nukes in our arsenal. We meet in Vienna. Carter's there for the United States. The Soviet Union's leader is Brezhnev, B-R-E-Z-H-N-E-V, Brezhnev. And what happens is they have talks, and more or less we agree to limit or to cut back on our nuclear weapons. But the thing is, we have to get these passed, or the United States has to get these this treaty more or less passed in Senate. It will never be passed, and here's why, okay? It has to do with the Middle East. Okay, so what happens in Iran? There is a U.S. embassy. A U.S. embassy in Iran is stormed by some anti-American Muslim militants. A lot of these are kind of college students, sort of speak, in Iran. And they storm the embassy and take everyone there hostage. And this will become the beginning of the Iranian hostage crisis. So the U.S. embassy in Tehran, which is where the embassy was in Iran, is taken over. And this is all over the news, the nightly news every night, kind of reporting on it. The nightly news is showing, you know, images of Iranians burning American flags and spitting on effigies of, you know, Uncle Sam. So the people in Iran, especially these militant fundamentalist Muslims who kind of took over the country, definitely are not liking Americans. And to add insult to injury, they took a bunch of Americans hostage. So that's not good. So what happens is when Americans kind of focused in Iran, the Soviet Union takes the opportunity, right, when the cat's away, the mice will play, to invade Afghanistan. What? 2 Middle Eastern countries? This is a mess. So Iran and Afghanistan are actually right next to each other. Afghanistan is to the right of, or I guess you could say to the east of Iran. And Afghanistan is kind of more or less on the border of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union just really wanted, you know, it likes to have its neighbors close. It wanted to take over Afghanistan, and who knows, after it took over Afghanistan, perhaps it could sneak its way into the oil-rich area of the Persian Gulf. So this is not a good thing for the United States. that Russia or the Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. But the thing is, Afghanistan is kind of the Vietnam of the Soviet Union. It becomes a hot mess for the Soviet Union. They spend about 9 years just kind of bogged down in guerrilla warfare within Afghanistan. Yes, what do I want to say about that? That's what I wanted to say about that. Okay, so in response to this invasion of Afghanistan, Carter places an embargo on the export of grain and technology to the Soviet Union. We boycott the Olympics that happened to be in Moscow that year. And the United States said they'd use any means necessary, including force, to protect the Persian Gulf. So we're saying if you are successful in Afghanistan and if you decide to continue on closer to the Persian Gulf, we will attack you. So things are not going so hot in foreign affairs. Let's talk about the conclusion of the Iranian hostage crisis, which also concludes this chapter. What happens is, since there's really no stable government in Iran to negotiate with, there's a couple failed rescue attempts that go underway to try to get the hostages out kind of in secret. Like I said, they both fail. One of them, two of the helicopters that were supposed to rescue the hostages actually end up colliding, and 8 of the wanted to be rescuers were killed. It's just a mess. Finally, after 444 days in captivity, the United States is able to diplomatically get their prisoners released, or the hostages released. Yeah, it's just a mess. And really, the Iranian hostage crisis, what sparked that was that the Shah of Iran, right, the guy who had been there from 53 to 79, who had oppressed the people, who were pro-American, whatever, after he was exiled, he became sick. He had cancer. So the United States admitted him to the United States for medical treatment of his cancer. And that's what really sparked this hostage crisis. That's why the embassy was supposedly stormed. But really, it went deeper than that. It was just kind of a symbol of their hatred for the United States. Okay, so our poor friend Carter, after giving this kind of melee speech and after this hostage crisis, he's really not going to have a prayer for re-election. And then we'll see our friend Ronald Reagan will take over next. But we are done with this chapter.